The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers and clattered against the concrete floor of my garage. Above me, the underside of Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick dripped oil like a mechanical rain cloud, each drop landing with a soft plip on my already stained coveralls. I was reaching for the wrench when I heard my daughter Sophie's voice drifting through the thin walls that separated my auto shop from our house. "You know what, Jess? Mom could do so much better than Dad." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I froze, my hand halfway to the tool. The conversation was coming through the open window above my workbench, clear as day in the still evening air of Plainsview. Our little town of 13,000 souls had a way of making every whisper feel like a megaphone announcement. "She deserves someone like Brandon," Sophie continued, her voice carrying that entitled tone she'd perfected since starting college. "He actually treats her like a queen, not like some mechanic's wife. God, I wish he was my stepdad instead." Nice to know I'm the family's favorite doormat, I thought, wiping my hands on a rag that had seen better decades. 23 years of marriage, 18 years of raising that ungrateful kid, and this is what I get. A front-row seat to my own character assassination. I rolled out from under the Buick and sat up, my back protesting the movement. At 42, I wasn't the young hotshot who'd opened Danny's Auto Repair, fresh out of technical school. The years had added gray to my brown hair and lines around my green eyes, but I'd built something here, something real, something that apparently wasn't good enough for my wife Claire or our daughter. The garage smelled like motor oil, brake fluid, and honest work, my kingdom of grease and chrome, where I'd spent countless hours keeping this town's vehicles running, while Claire climbed the social ladder at Prestige Realty. She'd started there 5 years ago as a part-time agent. Now she was their top seller, complete with a shiny BMW and designer clothes that cost more than most people in Plainsview made in a month. I walked to the window and peered through the grimy glass toward our house. The lights were on in the kitchen, casting a warm glow that should have felt welcoming. Instead, it looked like a stage set for a play I wasn't invited to join. Brandon. The name had been popping up in conversations for months now. Brandon this, Brandon that. He was some hotshot tech entrepreneur from the city, 30-something with perfect teeth and a sports car that probably cost more than my entire shop. He'd hired Claire to find him a weekend retreat in our area, and somehow that professional relationship had blossomed into something that made my daughter wish he was her father. The bell above my shop door chimed, and Mick Sullivan walked in. My best friend since high school, Mick owned the boxing gym 3 blocks over. He was built like a fire hydrant, short, solid, and impossible to knock down. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and his Sullivan's Gym t-shirt stretched tight across his barrel chest. "Working late again, Danny boy?" Mick asked, grabbing a beer from the mini-fridge I kept in the corner. "Claire's got that real estate meeting tonight, right?" "Something like that," I muttered, not trusting myself to say more. Mick had been my friend long enough to read the tension in my voice. "Everything okay at home?" He popped open the beer and leaned against my workbench, his dark eyes studying my face. I almost told him, almost spilled everything about the overheard conversation, about the growing distance between Claire and me, about how I felt like a stranger in my own house. Instead, I shrugged and grabbed my own beer. "Just tired. Mrs. Patterson's Buick is fighting me every step of the way." Mick nodded, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. "You know, Danny, sometimes the biggest problems aren't the ones under the hood." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message. Claire's name appeared on the screen. "Meeting running late. Don't wait up." It was 9:30 on a Tuesday night. What kind of real estate meeting ran this late in a town where most people were in bed by 10? "I should head home," I said, finishing my beer in one long gulp. "Want to grab dinner tomorrow? That new place on Main Street? Mick asked. Can't. Claire's got some fancy client dinner she wants me to attend. Apparently, I need to make a good impression. I made air quotes with my fingers, tasting the bitterness in my own voice. Mick raised an eyebrow. Since when do you care about impressing real estate clients? Since my wife started bringing home clients who look like male models, I thought, but didn't say. Instead, I just shrugged again and started cleaning up my tools. After Mick left, I locked up the shop and walked the 50 yards to my house. The kitchen was empty, but Claire's purse sat on the counter next to a stack of glossy real estate brochures. I flipped through them absently. Luxury homes, weekend retreats, the kind of properties that sold to people with more money than sense. One brochure caught my attention. A lakeside mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows and a price tag that made my eyes water. Written in Claire's neat handwriting across the top were the words, "Perfect for B. Call tomorrow." B for Brandon, I assumed, the mysterious client who'd been taking up so much of my wife's time lately. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The house was a modest two-story colonial, built in the 1950s, when Plainsview still had a thriving manufacturing base. We'd bought it 15 years ago when Sophie was 7, and life seemed full of possibilities. Now it felt like a museum of better times. Wedding photos lined the hallway walls, showing a younger, happier version of Claire and me. In one picture, we were dancing at our reception, her head thrown back in laughter at something I'd whispered in her ear. I couldn't remember what I'd said, but I remembered how she'd looked at me then, like I was her whole world. When was the last time she'd looked at me like that? I showered and climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house made me wonder if it was Claire coming home. Every car that passed on our quiet street might be hers. At 12:47 a.m., I heard the BMW pull into the driveway. The front door opened and closed softly, followed by the careful sound of high heels on hardwood. Claire was trying not to wake me. She slipped into the bedroom like a ghost, moving quietly in the darkness. I kept my breathing steady, pretending to sleep, while she undressed and brushed her teeth. When she finally slid into bed beside me, she smelled like expensive perfume and something else, men's cologne, that wasn't mine. "Danny," she whispered, "you awake?" I didn't answer. I couldn't trust what might come out of my mouth. She sighed softly and rolled away from me. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep. But I lay there staring at the ceiling until dawn, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. The next morning, Claire was already gone when I woke up. A note on the kitchen counter said she had an early showing and would see me at the client dinner. She'd signed it with a simple C, no love, no XOXO, just an initial. I made coffee and toast, the mundane routine feeling surreal after the night's revelations. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mrs. Dunley watering her flowers next door. She waved when she saw me, and I waved back. Mrs. Dunley had lived in Plainsview for 78 years and knew everyone's business better than they did themselves. "Morning, Danny," she called out. "Saw Claire leave early. That girl works too hard." "Yeah," I called back. "Real estate never sleeps." Mrs. Dunley nodded knowingly. "Saw her with that handsome young man yesterday. The one with the fancy car. New client?" My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. Which handsome young man would that be? "Oh, you know, tall, dark hair, drives that red sports car." They were looking at the old Henderson place, seemed very friendly. The old Henderson place had been empty for 2 years. It was a sprawling Victorian on the good side of town, the kind of house that attracted buyers with serious money and specific tastes. "I'm sure it was just business," I said, but the words felt like sawdust in my mouth. Mrs. Dunley gave me a look that said she'd seen enough of life to know the difference between business and pleasure. "Of course, dear, just business." I finished my coffee and headed to the shop, But my mind wasn't on carburetors and brake pads. It was on red sports cars and late-night meetings, and the way my wife had smelled like another man's cologne. The morning crawled by in a haze of routine maintenance and oil changes. Around noon, Sophie stopped by, looking radiant in the way that only 22-year-olds can manage. She was home from State University for spring break, and her Instagram-perfect appearance made my grease-stained garage look even shabbier by comparison. "Hey, Dad," she said, careful not to touch anything that might stain her white designer jeans. "Mom wanted me to remind you about tonight, 7 o'clock at Romano's." Romano's was the fanciest restaurant in Plainsview, the kind of place that charged $30 for a steak and made you feel underdressed even in your best suit. "Right, the client dinner." I wiped my hands on my coveralls. "Anyone I know?" Sophie's face lit up. "Actually, yeah. It's Brandon Mitchell, you know, the tech guy. He's amazing, Dad. He started his own company when he was 25, and now he's looking to expand into smaller markets. Mom says he might even open an office here in Plainsview." "How exciting," I said, my voice flat. "He's really cool. Not like the usual stuffy businessmen Mom deals with. He actually listens when you talk, you know? And he's funny, really funny." The way she talked about him made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just professional admiration. This was hero worship. "How long has your mother been working with him?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, months now. Since before Christmas, I think. He's been looking for the perfect property, but he's really picky. Mom says she's never worked so hard for a single client." Sophie laughed. "But it'll be worth it when he finally buys something. The commission alone will pay for my entire senior year." After Sophie left, I found myself staring at the calendar on my office wall. Before Christmas. That was 4 months ago. 4 months of late meetings, early showings, and mysterious phone calls that Claire took in the other room. The afternoon dragged on like a bad movie. Every customer who walked through my door seemed to have an opinion about something. The weather, the economy, the state of modern marriage. That last one came from old Pete Morrison, who'd been divorced 3 times and considered himself an expert on the subject. "The thing about women, Danny," Pete said while I rotated the tires on his pickup truck, "is they get ideas. Ideas about what they deserve, what they're missing, what life owes them. And once those ideas take root," he shook his head sadly, "well, let's just say a smart man keeps his eyes open." "Thanks for the advice, Pete," I muttered, but his words stuck with me long after he'd driven away. At 6 o'clock, I closed the shop and headed home to get ready for dinner. Claire's BMW was in the driveway, and I could hear her moving around upstairs. When I walked into our bedroom, she was standing in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting a black dress I'd never seen before. "Oh, good. You're here," she said, without turning around. "Can you zip me up?" I moved behind her and slowly pulled the zipper up her back. In the mirror, I could see her face. Carefully made up, her blonde hair styled in loose waves that framed her features perfectly. She looked beautiful. She also looked like she was getting ready for a date, not a business dinner. "New dress?" I asked. "This old thing?" She smoothed the fabric over her hips. "I've had it forever." The lie came so easily that I almost believed it myself. Almost. "So tell me about this Brandon guy," I said, moving to the closet to find my least wrinkled dress shirt. "What do you want to know?" Claire was applying lipstick now, her attention focused on her reflection. "Well, Sophie seems pretty impressed with him. Says he might open an office here." Claire's hand paused for just a moment before continuing with the lipstick. "He's considering it. Plainsview could use some fresh blood, some new opportunities." "And you've been working with him since Christmas?" "Something like that." She capped the lipstick and turned to face me. "Danny, this could be really big for us. For my career. Brandon's the kind of client who could open doors to a whole new level of business." The way she said his name, Brandon, with a softness that she hadn't used for mine in months, told me everything I needed to know. Romano's restaurant occupied the ground floor of what used to be Plainsview's First National Bank, back when the town had enough money to support a real financial institution. The original marble floors and ornate ceiling gave the place an air of faded grandeur that the owners tried to maintain with dim lighting and overpriced wine. Claire and I arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, and she immediately scanned the dining room like a hawk searching for prey. Her face brightened when she spotted a table near the window, where a man in an expensive suit was already seated checking his phone. Brandon Mitchell looked exactly like Central Casting would order for successful young entrepreneur. Tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair styled just messy enough to look casual but not sloppy. His suit was charcoal gray and fit him like it had been tailored specifically for his frame. When he saw Claire approaching, he stood and flashed a smile that belonged in a toothpaste commercial. "Claire!" He moved around the table to greet her, and I watched as he kissed her cheek, a gesture that lasted just a fraction of a second longer than strictly professional. "You look absolutely stunning. Brandon, I'd like you to meet my husband, Danny." Claire's voice had taken on a tone I hadn't heard in years, light, musical, almost girlish. Brandon extended his hand, and his grip was firm but not aggressive. "Danny, great to finally meet you. Claire talks about you all the time." I doubt that, I thought, but I managed a smile. "Likewise. I hear you're thinking about setting up shop in our little town." "That's the plan." Brandon gestured for us to sit, and I noticed how he held Claire's chair for her, a small courtesy that I'd stopped doing years ago, without really thinking about it. Plainsview has a lot of untapped potential. Sometimes the best opportunities are hiding in plain sight. The waiter appeared, and Brandon immediately ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week. Throughout the ordering process, he deferred to Claire's preferences, asked her opinion on everything, and generally treated her like the most fascinating woman in the room. I was invisible. "So, Danny," Brandon said after the waiter had left, "Claire tells me you own an auto repair shop. That must be rewarding work, keeping the community moving." It was the kind of polite small talk that people made when they were trying to be nice to someone they considered beneath them. His tone was friendly enough, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was already bored with the conversation. "It pays the bills," I said, "though I imagine it's not as exciting as the tech world." Brandon laughed, a sound that was probably meant to be modest, but came across as practiced. "Oh, you'd be surprised how boring most of it is. Lots of meetings, lots of spreadsheets. I envy guys like you who work with their hands, create something tangible." "Sure you do," I thought. "That's why you're wearing a suit that costs more than my monthly mortgage payment." "What kind of tech company are you running?" I asked. "Digital marketing solutions for small businesses. We help local companies establish their online presence, optimize their social media engagement, that sort of thing." Brandon's eyes lit up as he talked, and I could see why Sophie was impressed. He had the kind of enthusiasm that was either genuine passion or expertly crafted salesmanship. "Sounds complicated," I said. "It's really not. The beauty of what we do is making the complicated simple. Take your shop, for example. I bet you rely mostly on word-of-mouth referrals and maybe some Yellow Pages advertising, right?" I nodded, wondering where this was going. With the right digital strategy, you could probably triple your customer base within 6 months. Online reviews, targeted social media campaigns, search engine optimization, the works. Claire leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "That sounds amazing, Brandon. Danny, you should really consider it." "Maybe," I said, non-committally. The truth was, I'd been thinking about expanding my online presence for years, but the technical side of it intimidated me. Hearing about it from Brandon, though, made me want to stick with the Yellow Pages out of pure spite. The wine arrived, and Brandon made a show of tasting it before nodding his approval. He poured glasses for Claire and himself, then seemed to remember I existed, and filled mine as well. "To new opportunities," he said, raising his glass. We toasted, and I watched as Claire's eyes met Brandon's over the rim of her wineglass. There was something electric in that moment, a connection that excluded me completely. The conversation flowed easily between Claire and Brandon, touching on real estate trends, market opportunities, and the future of small-town America. They spoke the same language, a mixture of business jargon and optimistic speculation that sounded impressive but didn't really mean anything concrete. I tried to contribute when I could, but mostly I felt like a third wheel at their private party. Every story Brandon told made him sound more successful, more worldly, more everything that I wasn't. And Claire hung on every word like he was revealing the secrets of the universe. "The lakeside property you showed me yesterday was perfect," Brandon said, as our appetizers arrived. "The location, the view, the potential for renovation, it's exactly what I've been looking for." "I knew you'd love it," Claire said, beaming. "The moment I saw it, I thought, this is Brandon's house." "You have excellent instincts," Brandon said, and the way he looked at her made my stomach turn. "You went to see a property yesterday?" I asked Claire. "I thought you had that conference call with the Henderson people." Claire's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Oh, that got moved to later in the day. The property showing was just a quick detour." Another lie, delivered with the same casual ease as the story about the dress. "The Henderson place is beautiful," Brandon said, apparently unaware of the tension. "Victorian architecture, original hardwood floors, that incredible wraparound porch. It needs work, but it has so much character." I felt like I was watching a tennis match, my head turning back and forth between them as they discussed properties, renovation plans, and market values. They were building a fantasy together, brick by brick, and I was just an observer. The main course arrived, and Brandon regaled us with stories about his company's success, his plans for expansion, and his vision for bringing modern business practices to traditional small towns. He was charming, I had to admit. Smooth without being slick, confident without being arrogant. If I'd met him under different circumstances, I might have actually liked him. But I could see the way Claire responded to him. The way she leaned in when he spoke, the way she laughed at his jokes, the way she seemed to come alive in his presence. It was like watching my wife transform into someone I barely recognized. "Danny, what do you think about bringing more tech businesses to Plainsview?" Brandon asked, making an obvious effort to include me in the conversation. "I think change is inevitable," I said carefully. "The question is whether it's change for the better or just change for the sake of change." Brandon nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very wise perspective. Change should serve the community, not the other way around. That's why I'm taking my time with this decision. I want to make sure I'm contributing something valuable, not just chasing profit." It was a good answer, the kind of thing that sounded noble and community-minded. But there was something in his eyes that suggested his definition of valuable contribution might be different from mine. As the evening wore on, I found myself studying Brandon more carefully. He was polished, professional, and said all the right things, but there were small tells that suggested the image wasn't quite as perfect as it appeared. His watch was expensive, but not the top-of-the-line model he probably wanted people to think it was. His suit was well-tailored, but showed signs of frequent wear. And when the check came, I noticed a brief moment of calculation in his eyes before he reached for his wallet. "This is on me," he said with a smile. "Consider it a thank you for all of Claire's hard work." But when he opened his wallet, I caught a glimpse of the interior. It was well-organized and professional-looking, but there weren't many bills visible. For someone who was supposedly ready to drop serious money on lakeside real estate, he seemed to be traveling light in the cash department. "That's very generous," Claire said, her hand briefly touching his arm. "But you don't have to—" "I insist," Brandon said, pulling out a credit card. "Besides, I'm hoping this is just the first of many celebrations." The way he looked at Claire when he said it made the subtext crystal clear. This wasn't about real estate anymore, if it ever had been. We said our goodbyes in the restaurant parking lot, and I watched as Brandon kissed Claire's cheek again, the same lingering gesture he'd used when we arrived. Then he shook my hand and thanked me for a wonderful evening, as if I'd contributed anything more than my physical presence. "Great guy," Claire said as we drove home in her BMW. "Really impressive." "Yeah, he seems successful," I said, choosing my words carefully. "He is, and he's interested in more than just buying property here, Danny. He's talking about really investing in the community, creating jobs, bringing new energy to the town." "What kind of jobs?" "Marketing positions, tech support, administrative work. Good jobs, the kind that might convince young people to stay in Plainsview instead of moving to the city." It was a compelling vision, I had to admit. Plainsview had been bleeding young talent for years, as kids graduated high school and immediately headed for bigger cities with better opportunities. The idea of reversing that trend was appealing, but something about Brandon's presentation felt off, like a movie set that looked convincing from a distance but revealed its flimsy construction up close. "How well do you know him?" I asked as we pulled into our driveway. "What do you mean?" "I mean, has he provided references, financial statements, proof that he can actually do what he's promising?" Claire turned off the engine and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Danny, he's a client, not a criminal. I'm not running a background check on everyone who wants to buy real estate. I'm just saying he talks a good game, but talk is cheap. Anyone can claim to be successful. Are you jealous?" The question came out of nowhere, delivered in a tone that was half amused, half accusatory. Jealous of what? Of Brandon, of his success, his ambition, his vision for the future. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could have deflected, made a joke, changed the subject. Instead, I decided to push back. "Should I be jealous, Claire?" Her face flushed, and for a moment I thought she might actually answer honestly. Instead, she grabbed her purse and got out of the car. "You're being ridiculous," she said, walking toward the house without looking back. But as I followed her up the front steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the one being ridiculous. Ridiculous for trusting, for believing, for pretending that everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. That night, as Claire slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the evening in my mind. Brandon's confident smile, Claire's animated responses, the easy chemistry between them that excluded me completely. And I realized that somewhere between the appetizers and dessert, I'd made a decision. I was going to find out exactly who Brandon Mitchell really was and what he really wanted from my wife. I started my investigation the way any self-respecting small-town mechanic would, by asking Mrs. Dunley what she'd seen. The next morning, I found her in her garden, tending to the roses that had made her yard the envy of Elm Street for the past 30 years. "Morning, Mrs. Dunley," I called over the fence that separated our properties. "Oh, hello, Danny. How was your fancy dinner last night?" News traveled fast in Plainsview, but Mrs. Dunley's information network was legendary. She probably knew what we'd ordered before the waiter had finished taking our plates away. "It was educational," I said. "That client of Claire's, Brandon Mitchell, have you seen much of him around town?" Mrs. Dunley's eyes lit up with the gleam of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this question. "Oh my, yes. That red sports car is hard to miss. He's been coming around for months now." "Months?" "Since before Christmas, at least. Always very well dressed, very polite. Waves when he sees me." She paused, snipping a dead bloom from one of her prize roses. "Though I have to say, Danny, he seems to spend an awful lot of time at your house when you're at work." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Business meetings, I'm sure." "I'm sure," Mrs. Dunley agreed, but her tone suggested she was anything but sure. "Just seems like an awful lot of business for one client." I thanked her and headed to work, my mind racing. Mrs. Dunley was many things, nosy, opinionated, occasionally meddling, but she wasn't a liar. If she said Brandon had been coming to my house regularly, then he had been. The question was, what kind of business required that level of personal attention? At the shop, I tried to focus on work, but my hands were going through the motions while my brain churned through possibilities. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Brandon really was just a demanding client who required extra hand-holding. Maybe Claire was simply being thorough in her customer service. Maybe I was an idiot. Around 10 o'clock, Mick stopped by with coffee and donuts from Murphy's Bakery. He took one look at my face and whistled low. "You look like someone ran over your dog. What's going on?" I told him about the dinner, about Mrs. Dunley's observations, about the growing certainty that my marriage was falling apart in slow motion. Mick listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making non-committal sounds. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers. "You know what you need to do," he finally said. "What's that?" "You need to know for sure, one way or the other." He looked up at me, his expression serious. "This wondering, this second-guessing everything, it's going to eat you alive. Either she's cheating, or she's not. Either your marriage is over, or it's not. But you need to know which one it is." "And how exactly do I find that out?" "Follow her." The suggestion hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. Following my own wife felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Once I took that step, there would be no going back to the comfortable illusion of trust. "I can't spy on Claire," I said. "That's not who I am." "Danny, listen to me." Mick leaned forward, his voice intense. "I've been married to Linda for 26 years. We've had our ups and downs, our fights and our makeups. But I've never, not once, wondered if she was screwing around on me. You know why?" I shook my head. "Because she doesn't act like she's screwing around. She doesn't come home smelling like another man's cologne. She doesn't take mysterious phone calls in the other room. She doesn't light up like a Christmas tree when some other guy's name gets mentioned." Each point hit home like a physical blow. "The Danny I know wouldn't let someone make a fool of him," Mick continued. "The Danny I know would want to know the truth, even if it hurt." He was right, and I knew it. But knowing and accepting are two different things. "What if I'm wrong?" I asked. "What if I follow her and find out she really is just doing her job? How do I explain that level of distrust?" "And what if you're right?" Mick countered. "How do you explain letting it continue when you could have stopped it?" After Mick left, I spent the rest of the morning wrestling with the decision. Every rational part of my brain said that spying on my wife was wrong, that it violated the basic trust that marriage was supposed to be built on. But that same rational part also had to acknowledge that the trust might already be broken. The decision was made for me around noon, when Claire called to say she had another late meeting and wouldn't be home for dinner. "With Brandon?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Among others, it's a group thing. Potential investors, local business leaders. Very boring stuff." Another lie. I could hear it in her voice now, the slight hesitation before she spoke, the overly casual tone that suggested she was trying too hard to sound normal. "Where's the meeting?" "The conference room at Prestige. Don't wait up. It could run pretty late." After she hung up, I sat in my office staring at the phone. A group meeting at her real estate office was easy enough to verify. All I had to do was drive by and see if the lights were on, if there were multiple cars in the parking lot. It was innocent enough. Just a concerned husband checking to make sure his wife was safe. At 7 o'clock, I locked up the shop and drove to Prestige Realty. The office was located in a converted house on Main Street, with a small parking lot in back. As I pulled into the lot, I could see that the building was dark except for a single light in what I knew was Claire's office. There were only 2 cars in the lot, Claire's BMW and a red sports car that I recognized from the restaurant. So much for the group meeting with potential investors. I parked across the street and waited, feeling like a private detective in a bad movie. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that there could be an innocent explanation. Maybe the other attendees hadn't arrived yet. Maybe they were meeting somewhere else first. Maybe I was about to confirm my worst fears. At 7:45, the light in Claire's office went out. A few minutes later, she and Brandon emerged from the building together. Even from across the street, I could see the easy familiarity between them. The way he put his hand on the small of her back as they walked, the way she leaned into him slightly as they talked. They stood by her car for several minutes, talking in low voices. Then Brandon leaned down and kissed her. Not on the cheek this time, on the lips. A real kiss that lasted long enough to remove any doubt about what I was witnessing. When they finally broke apart, Claire looked around nervously, as if suddenly remembering that they were in a public place. Brandon said something that made her laugh, then got into his sports car. Claire waited until he'd driven away before getting into her BMW. I sat in my truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching my wife drive home to lie to me about where she'd been and what she'd been doing. 23 years of marriage, reduced to a parking lot kiss that confirmed everything I'd been afraid to admit to myself. Claire was having an affair. The drive home was a blur of anger, hurt, and a strange sense of relief. At least now I knew. The wondering was over, the uncertainty resolved. My marriage was a lie, my wife was a cheater, and my daughter thought her mother deserved better than me. But knowing and acting on that knowledge were two different things entirely. When I got home, Claire's car was already in the driveway. I found her in the kitchen, heating up leftover Chinese food and humming softly to herself. She looked relaxed, happy even, the way she used to look when we were first married and everything was new and exciting. "How was the meeting?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Long and boring, just like I predicted," she said without turning around. "A lot of talk about market projections and investment strategies. You would have hated it." The lie came so easily that I almost admired her skill. If I hadn't seen the kiss with my own eyes, I might have believed her completely. "Anyone interesting there?" "The usual suspects. Brandon, of course, and a few other business types from the city. Oh, and that new lawyer who opened the practice on Oak Street. What's his name? Patterson? She was building an elaborate fiction, adding details to make it more believable. It was almost impressive in a sick way." "Sounds productive," I said. "We'll see. These things take time." She finally turned around, and I was struck by how beautiful she looked. Flushed, energetic, alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. The affair was good for her, apparently. The realization made me want to put my fist through the wall. Instead, I went upstairs and took a shower, standing under the hot water and trying to figure out what to do next. Confrontation seemed like the obvious choice, but what would that accomplish? Claire would deny everything. I'd have to admit to following her, and we'd end up in a screaming match that would resolve nothing. Divorce was another option, but the thought of splitting up our assets, fighting over custody of Sophie, even though she was an adult, and becoming another Plainsview scandal made my stomach turn. Or I could pretend I didn't know and hope the affair burned itself out naturally. But that felt like the coward's way out, and I'd never been a coward. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Claire's steady breathing beside me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her yet, and I wasn't going to file for divorce. Instead, I was going to learn everything I could about Brandon Mitchell and his supposed business empire. If Claire wanted to throw away our marriage for a smooth-talking entrepreneur, I was going to make sure she knew exactly what kind of man she was throwing it away for, and if Brandon thought he could waltz into my town and steal my wife without consequences, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The game was just beginning. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 23 years of marriage. I called in sick to work when I wasn't actually sick. Instead of opening the shop, I drove to the public library and asked Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, to help me use the internet for business research. Mrs. Henderson was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of helpful efficiency that made small-town libraries function. She set me up at one of the computers and gave me a quick tutorial on search engines and business databases. "What kind of business are you researching, Danny?" she asked. "Digital marketing. There's a company that might be expanding into Plainsview, and I want to know more about them." It wasn't exactly a lie, which made me feel slightly better about the deception. I started with a simple search for Brandon Mitchell Digital Marketing and was surprised by how little came up. A few LinkedIn profiles, a basic company website for something called Mitchell Digital Solutions, and a handful of mentions in local business journals from various cities. The company website looked professional enough: clean design, corporate buzzwords, testimonials from satisfied clients. But as I dug deeper, I started noticing problems. The testimonials were generic and could have applied to any business. The case studies were vague and didn't include specific numbers or verifiable results. And most tellingly, the company's address was listed as a P.O. box in a city 3 hours away. I spent the next 2 hours following digital breadcrumbs, and what I found painted a very different picture of Brandon Mitchell than the successful entrepreneur he'd presented at dinner. His LinkedIn profile claimed he'd founded Mitchell Digital Solutions 5 years ago, but the earliest mentions of the company I could find were from less than 2 years ago. Before that, there were gaps in his employment history that he'd tried to cover with vague references to consulting work and strategic planning. The business journals that mentioned him were all from small towns similar to Plainsview, places where a smooth-talking outsider could make a big impression without much scrutiny. But when I looked for follow-up articles about the success of his ventures in those towns, I found nothing. Most interesting of all was a brief mention in a newspaper from a town called Millfield, about 4 hours north of Plainsview. The article was from 8 months ago and described a business development initiative that had fallen through, leaving several local investors out of pocket and a planned office complex empty. The company behind the failed initiative was Mitchell Digital Solutions. I printed out everything I could find and drove home, my mind racing with possibilities. Brandon wasn't the successful entrepreneur he claimed to be. He was a con man, moving from town to town and leaving disappointed investors in his wake. But what was his angle in Plainsview? He wasn't asking local people to invest in his company. As far as I knew, he was just looking to buy real estate and possibly open a small office. Unless the real estate was the con. I spent the afternoon at the county courthouse looking through property records and business filings. What I found there made the pieces start falling into place. Brandon had put offers on 3 different properties in Plainsview over the past 4 months, all of them expensive, all of them requiring significant down payments. But in each case, he'd withdrawn the offer at the last minute, citing financing issues or changed business requirements. Each time, he'd tied up the property for weeks with his offer, preventing other potential buyers from making deals. And each time, Claire had invested significant time and effort in facilitating the transaction, time that she couldn't bill to other clients. It was starting to look like Brandon's real business wasn't digital marketing. It was manipulating real estate agents into providing free services while he played games with property owners. But that still didn't explain why he'd target Claire specifically, or why he'd escalate the relationship to a physical affair. The answer to that question came from an unexpected source. Sophie. She called that evening while I was making dinner, her voice bubbling with excitement about something that had happened at school. In the course of the conversation, she mentioned that she'd been telling her friends about Brandon and his plans for Plainsview. "Jess thinks it's so cool that Mom's working with someone famous," Sophie said. "Famous?" "Well, you know, successful, rich, the kind of guy who could really put Plainsview on the map." "Sophie, what exactly has your mother told you about Brandon's wealth?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear her thinking. "Just that he's looking at really expensive properties, and he's talking about major investments in the town." "Why?" "Just curious. How expensive are we talking about? I don't know exactly, but Mom mentioned something about him looking at that mansion out by the lake. You know, the old Whitmore place. That's like $1 million property. The Whitmore mansion had been on the market for 2 years, with a price tag that put it out of reach for most buyers. If Brandon was seriously considering it, he'd need to prove he had access to serious money. Has he made an offer on it? I think so. Mom's been really excited about it. She said the commission alone would pay for a new car and maybe a vacation to Europe. After Sophie hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. $1 million real estate deal would generate a commission of around $60,000, more money than Claire had ever made on a single sale. No wonder she was invested in keeping Brandon happy. But based on my research, Brandon Mitchell didn't have access to the kind of money needed to buy $1 million property, which meant he was either lying about his financial resources or he was planning some kind of fraud. Either way, my wife was about to get hurt professionally as well as personally. The question was, did I warn her, or did I let her find out the hard way? That night, I waited until Claire was asleep and then quietly went down to her home office. I'd never snooped through her business files before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Her desk was organized with the same attention to detail that she brought to everything else in her life. Client files were arranged alphabetically, contracts were sorted by date, and her computer was password protected. But she'd always been predictable with passwords. I tried Sophie's birthday, our anniversary, her mother's maiden name. On the 4th try, her birthday combined with our house number, I was in. Her email account contained months of correspondence with Brandon, and reading through it was like watching my marriage dissolve in real time. The early emails were strictly professional, property listings, market analyses, scheduling appointments, but gradually they became more personal. Brandon started including little jokes, personal observations, compliments about Claire's professionalism and expertise. Claire's responses showed a similar progression. Her initial formal tone gave way to warmth, then to something that could only be described as flirtation. By February, they were exchanging emails that had nothing to do with real estate, restaurant recommendations, book suggestions, observations about small-town life. Brandon was charming, funny, and attentive in ways that I apparently hadn't been for years. The most recent emails were the hardest to read. They were planning meetings that weren't about business, making references to private jokes, and using language that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. But buried in the romantic correspondence were details about Brandon's financial situation that told a different story than his public persona. He'd asked Claire to delay submitting his offer on the Whitmore mansion, citing temporary cash flow issues. He'd requested extensions on earnest money deposits, and in one particularly revealing email, he'd asked Claire if she knew any local investors who might be interested in ground-floor opportunities with his company. Brandon Mitchell wasn't just having an affair with my wife. He was setting her up to be the front person for some kind of investment scam targeting the people of Plainsview. I printed out the most damaging emails and put them in a folder, then carefully logged out of Claire's computer and went back to bed. She was still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that her perfect new life was built on lies. The next morning, I called Mick and asked him to meet me at the diner on Route 9, outside of town where we were less likely to be overheard by the Plainsview gossip network. I showed him everything I'd found, the research about Brandon's failed ventures, the property records showing his pattern of withdrawn offers, and the emails that revealed both the affair and the potential fraud. Mick read through it all in silence, occasionally whistling softly or shaking his head. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Danny, this is bad, really bad." "I know. This guy isn't just screwing around with your wife. He's planning to rip off half the town, and he's using Claire to do it. That's what it looks like." Mick was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the traffic on Route 9. "What are you going to do?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all night. I had evidence of adultery, evidence of fraud, and evidence that my wife was either a willing participant or an unwitting pawn in a scheme to defraud our neighbors and friends. "I'm going to stop him," I said. "How?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not going to let him destroy Claire's career and rip off this town, and I'm sure as hell not going to let him make a fool of me." Mick nodded slowly. "Whatever you need, Danny. I'm with you." As we drove back into town, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. For too long, I'd been a passive observer in my own life, watching my marriage crumble and my family fall apart without fighting back. That was about to change. Brandon Mitchell had made a serious mistake when he chose Plainsview as his hunting ground. He thought he was dealing with small-town rubes who would be easy to manipulate and deceive. He was about to learn that some small-town guys know how to fight back. The problem with living in a small town is that everyone knows your business. The advantage of living in a small town is that everyone knows everyone else's business too. If I was going to take down Brandon Mitchell, I'd need allies, people who had as much to lose as I did if his schemes succeeded. My first stop was Murphy's Bakery, where the morning coffee crowd gathered to discuss everything from the weather to local politics. Murphy's was the unofficial information exchange of Plainsview, and if you wanted to know what was really happening in town, you listened to the conversations over coffee and donuts. Old Pete Morrison was holding court at his usual table, surrounded by other retirees who had nothing better to do than analyze everyone else's life choices. Perfect. "Morning, Pete," I said, grabbing a cup of coffee and a glazed donut. "Danny, heard you had dinner with that fancy tech fellow the other night. What did you think of him?" Word traveled fast, as always. "Interesting guy," I said carefully. "Very ambitious." "Ambitious is right," said Frank Kowalski, who'd run the hardware store until his son took over. "Been asking a lot of questions around town about investment opportunities." This was news to me. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, you know, who's got money to invest, which businesses might be looking for partners, that sort of thing," Frank said. "My boy Tommy mentioned that Mitchell stopped by the store last week, asking about local contractors and construction costs." "Construction costs for what?" "Didn't say exactly. Just general questions about building costs, permit processes, that kind of thing." Pete leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I heard from my nephew at the bank that Mitchell's been asking about commercial loans too. Big ones." This was getting more interesting by the minute. "How big?" "500,000, maybe more. For some kind of office complex and light manufacturing facility." I nearly choked on my coffee. Brandon was planning something much bigger than I'd realized, and he was planning to finance it with other people's money. "That's a lot of investment for a small town," I said. "That's what I thought," Pete agreed. "But your wife seems pretty excited about it. Claire's been telling everyone who'll listen about the jobs it's going to bring, the economic development, the whole 9 yards. My stomach sank. Claire wasn't just having an affair and facilitating real estate fraud, she was actively promoting Brandon's scheme to the entire town. I finished my coffee and left Murphy's with a lot more information than I'd expected. My next stop was the bank, where I had a standing appointment every month to review my business accounts. First National Bank of Plainsview occupied a brick building that had been the cornerstone of Main Street since 1923. The current president, Jim Watkins, had gone to high school with me and knew every business owner in town personally. "Danny, good to see you," Jim said, shaking my hand as I entered his office. "How's business?" "Can't complain." "Listen, Jim, I wanted to ask you about something I heard this morning. Someone mentioned that there's been interest in large commercial loans lately." Jim's expression became guarded. "You know I can't discuss specific loan applications, Danny. I'm not asking for details. I'm just wondering if you've had anyone approach you about financing for major development projects." Jim was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Let's just say that we've had some inquiries about significant financing for projects that seem optimistic for a town our size." "Optimistic how?" The kind of projects that look great on paper but don't always account for local market realities. Jim leaned back in his chair. Danny, is there something specific you're concerned about? I decided to take a calculated risk. I've been doing some research on Brandon Mitchell and his company. What I've found suggests that his track record might not be as solid as he claims. Jim's eyebrows rose slightly. That's interesting. What kind of research? I pulled out a folder containing printouts of the articles I'd found about Brandon's failed ventures in other towns. Jim read through them carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. This is very concerning, he said finally. If even half of this is accurate, Mr. Mitchell has left a trail of disappointed investors and unfinished projects. That's what I thought too. Jim, has he actually submitted a formal loan application? Not yet, but he's scheduled to meet with our loan committee next week. He's requested a preliminary discussion about financing options for a mixed-use development project. What kind of mixed-use development? Office space, light manufacturing, retail, the works. He's talking about a $20 million project that would supposedly create 200 jobs. $20 million, 200 jobs. The scope of Brandon's ambitions was staggering, and so was the potential for disaster if his scheme collapsed. Jim, I think you should see this before that meeting, I said, handing him copies of all the research I'd compiled. Jim nodded grimly. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Danny. We'll definitely be doing our own due diligence before considering any loan application. My next stop was City Hall, where I found Mayor Patricia Hendricks in her office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and looking harried. Pat had been mayor for 6 years and took her responsibility to the town seriously. Danny, what brings you by? She asked, gesturing for me to sit down. I wanted to talk to you about Brandon Mitchell and his development plans. Pat's face lit up. Oh, isn't it exciting? The economic impact study he provided shows tremendous potential for job creation and tax revenue. It could be exactly what Plainsview needs to revitalize the downtown area. He provided an economic impact study? A very impressive one. Professional charts, growth projections, the whole package. Pat shuffled through papers on her desk and pulled out a bound document. Here, take a look. The study was indeed impressive-looking, full of graphs and statistics that painted a rosy picture of Plainsview's economic future under Brandon's development plan. But as I flipped through it, I noticed something odd. Pat, this study is dated 3 weeks ago, but it references demographic data that's 2 years old. And some of these projections seem awfully optimistic. What do you mean? I pointed to a chart showing projected job growth. This assumes that Plainsview will attract workers from a 50-mile radius, but it doesn't account for the fact that most of the towns in that radius are losing population, not gaining it. Pat frowned, looking at the document more carefully. I hadn't noticed that. And this revenue projection assumes that all 200 jobs will be filled within the first year, with an average salary of $50,000. That's pretty ambitious for a startup operation in a small town. The more I pointed out problems with the study, the more concerned Pat became. By the time I'd finished my analysis, she was looking distinctly worried. Danny, do you think this whole thing might be some kind of scam? I pulled out my folder of research about Brandon's previous ventures and showed her the articles about failed projects and disappointed investors. Pat read through everything twice, her expression growing grimmer with each page. This is very troubling. If Mr. Mitchell has a history of failed projects, we need to be much more careful about any commitments the city might make. What kind of commitments are we talking about? Tax incentives, zoning variances, infrastructure improvements, the usual package we offer to attract major employers. Pat set down the papers and looked at me directly. Danny, why are you bringing this to me? What's your interest in this situation? It was a fair question, and one I'd been dreading. Brandon Mitchell is close to my family. I want to make sure that if he's planning something that could hurt the town, People know about it before it's too late. Pat nodded slowly. I appreciate you looking out for the community. I'll make sure the city council sees this information before we make any decisions about supporting his project. As I left City Hall, I felt like I was making progress. The bank would be skeptical of Brandon's loan application, and the city would think twice before offering him incentives. But I still hadn't addressed the most immediate problem: my wife's involvement in his schemes. That evening, I found Claire in her home office, working on what looked like marketing materials for Brandon's development project. Glossy brochures, artists' renderings of office buildings, and promotional copy that made Plainsview sound like the next Silicon Valley. "Working late?" I asked from the doorway. Claire looked up, slightly startled. "Oh, hi, honey. Just finishing up some materials for Brandon's presentation to the city council." "Presentation?" "Next week. He's going to outline his development plans and request the city's support." Claire's eyes were bright with excitement. "Danny, this could be huge for us, for the whole town. And for your commission." "Well, yes, there's that too. But it's about more than money. It's about bringing Plainsview into the 21st century." I looked at the materials spread across her desk. Professional quality graphics, detailed architectural plans, financial projections that looked impressive if you didn't examine them too closely. "Claire, have you verified any of this? The financial projections, the job creation estimates, Brandon's ability to actually finance a project this size?" Claire's expression shifted from excitement to annoyance. "Of course I have. Danny, this is my job. I know how to evaluate a client's credibility." "Do you?" "Because I've been doing some research on Brandon's company, and what I found is pretty concerning." "What kind of research?" I could have shown her everything right then: the failed projects, the disappointed investors, the pattern of withdrawn real estate offers. But something in her tone, a defensiveness that went beyond professional pride, told me she wouldn't believe it, or wouldn't want to believe it. Just general background stuff, business records, references, that sort of thing. And I think you should be careful. Sometimes things that look too good to be true actually are too good to be true." Claire stood up, her hands planted on her hips in a posture I recognized as her preparing for battle stance. "Danny, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but I'm getting tired of the constant skepticism and negativity. Brandon is offering this town an incredible opportunity, and all you can do is look for problems. I'm trying to protect you, Claire, and protect our town." "From what? From success? From growth? From someone who actually has vision and ambition?" The words hung in the air between us like an accusation. "Someone who actually has vision and ambition, unlike your small-town mechanic husband." "Fine," I said quietly. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "There's nothing to be careful about," Claire said, turning back to her work. "Everything's going to be wonderful." As I walked away from her office, I realized that I'd reached a decision point. Claire was too invested, financially and emotionally, to listen to warnings about Brandon. The town officials would be more cautious now, but that wouldn't stop Brandon from pursuing his schemes through other channels. If I was going to stop him, I'd have to do it myself, and I was going to have to be smarter about it than he was.